"Please, don't pull it," the giant widow begged. The rancher did, and his blood ran cold. He didn't believe in God anymore. Not after the war, not after her husband was killed. The fields had been his only church since then. Wide, empty, wind-carved places where a man could talk to ghosts without judgment. He'd promised her husband once, long before the war and the whiskey, that he'd never let her fall. But promises are easy when no one's bleeding in your hands. Now the desert smelled like iron and smoke. His horse snorted behind him, stamping at the sand as the wind dragged lines of dust across the plain. The sun sat low and mean over the hills, and in front of him on her knees was the biggest woman he'd ever seen brought low, Martha Calder, the giant widow. She'd been taller than most men, stronger too, the kind who could swing an axe at dawn and run a ranch by sundown. But now she was trembling, her back heaving with every breath, an arrow buried deep in her shoulder. Blood ran down her arm and caught the light like rusted fire. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of pain. "Don't pull it." "I'll bleed out if you do." Silas Boone froze. His hands, rough from years of rope and rifle, hovered uselessly above the wound. He'd seen men die from less. He'd seen them pray too, and it never changed a thing. The desert didn't care about prayers. It only cared about who had the strength to crawl one more yard before night took them. "Martha," he said quietly, "I can't just leave it in." Her eyes, blue, wild, defiant, lifted to his. "You'll kill me faster if you do." A gust of wind cut between them, dry as bone. In the distance, coyotes called, short, sharp cries that carried like warnings. Silas turned his head. On the far ridge, 3 horses moved against the sunset, black silhouettes gliding closer. Raiders, the same bastards who had taken her land, her cattle, and her husband's life 6 months ago. "They're coming," he muttered. She clenched her jaw. "Then ride. Leave me here." He stared at her, this towering woman, half dead, still trying to order him away. Even bleeding out, she sounded like someone who expected the world to listen. "Not this time," he said, her breath hitched, half pain, half laughter. "You never were good at obeying," he smiled without humor, "and you never were good at dying." Then the thunder of hooves echoed again. Closer now, faster. The men were minutes away. He had a choice. Run and live with the shame, or stay and fight with nothing but an old revolver and a dying woman who didn't want his help. He hated choices like that. They always made him remember the war. He slid his hand around the arrow's shaft. It was warm, slick with her blood. He felt her body tighten beneath his touch. "Silas," she whispered, voice trembling. "Don't. I can make it if you—" "No, you can't," he said, voice breaking. "And I can't either. Not if I leave you here." She tried to shake her head, but the movement sent a wave of agony through her. He saw it in the way her teeth bit her lip, in the tears that glimmered but didn't fall. And in that second, something old and buried inside him cracked open. The war, the graves, the broken promises, they all came back in her eyes. He took a breath, steady, final. Then he pulled. The arrow slid free with a sound he'd never forget, a wet whisper between life and death. Her scream tore through the desert like thunder. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Even the wind held its breath. He caught her before she fell forward, his hands stained red. Then she went still. "Martha," his voice broke.
"Martha!"
Her head dropped against his chest, and for one sickening second he thought he'd killed her. The world blurred, the sand, the blood, the sun sinking like a dying fire. He pressed his hand to her wound, but the blood kept coming, warm and endless. "God!" "No," he whispered, but there was no God left to hear him. Only the sound of hooves growing louder, 6 riders now, maybe more, and then, faint but steady, her chest rose, a gasp. Her breath, her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him through pain and disbelief.
"You fool!"
she murmured, her lips trembling. "You saved me." Before he could speak, the riders crested the ridge. Silas dragged her behind a fallen wagon, hands shaking, blood still on them. The raiders' laughter carried on the wind, cruel and careless. Martha's voice was barely a whisper. "My husband hid something beneath the barn. If they find it, they'll kill everyone who's ever worn our name." Silas leaned close. "Then they won't find it," she smiled weakly. "You still think you can fix everything?" He didn't answer. He checked his revolver, 3 bullets left. He'd faced worse odds. He'd face them again. But as the riders closed in, he looked at her one last time and realized something he hadn't in years. He cared whether he lived or died, because for the first time since the war, someone needed him again. The sky darkened, dust rose. The first rider shouted, "The widow's still breathing!" Silas gripped his gun. His voice was low but certain. "Not for long, if I have anything to say about it." And when the first shot split the evening air, the old rancher stood tall against the dying light, his blood cold, his heart burning, ready to fight for the promise he'd broken and the woman he'd just brought back from the edge of death. The gunfire came fast, too fast for thought, too loud for prayer. The first bullet tore into the wagon, splintering wood beside Silas's face. Dust exploded around them. Martha gasped, clutching her bleeding shoulder, eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Silas ducked low, reloading with trembling hands. The raiders whooped like devils, 6 shadows against a sky gone orange with fire and dust. He'd seen this before. He'd heard this sound before. The chaos of men who loved killing more than coin. It was the sound of the war coming back. Silas shouted over the roar, "Stay down!" Martha coughed, her voice hoarse. "You can't win this." "Maybe not," he said, sliding another bullet into the chamber. "But I can make 'em bleed trying." He rose just high enough to fire. The first shot cracked through the dusk, and one rider fell hard, tumbling from his horse in a cloud of sand. The others scattered, circling like wolves. Silas ducked back down, breathing hard. He could smell the powder, the iron, the blood. Martha reached for him, her hand slick with her own blood. "There's a cellar," she whispered, trembling. "Behind the barn. My husband, he built it to hide the gold. And us, if it ever came to this. Gold," Silas said, staring at her. She nodded weakly. "They killed him for it, but they didn't find it." He hesitated. She saw the doubt in his face and smiled faintly through the pain. "Don't look at me like that. It ain't greed, it's survival." The next bullet hit the wagon again, spraying them with splinters. Martha winced. Silas pulled her close, shielding her as he peered over the edge. The raiders were closing in, torches now lit, the firelight licking across their grinning faces. One called out, "Throw down your iron, old man." "Ain't worth dying for a half-dead widow," Silas shouted back. "Then come and collect her yourself." That bought him silence, a heavy one. He knew that quiet. It was the breath before a charge. He turned to Martha. "You can walk?" She nodded, though he could see she couldn't. Her lips were pale, her breath short. "I'll carry you then." Silas, he didn't wait for her permission. He lifted her into his arms, ignoring the way she cried out from the pain. She was heavy, muscle and bone from years of working the ranch, but he held her steady. Her blood soaked into his shirt, hot as a brand. They broke from cover just as the riders spurred forward. Bullets hissed past them. He ran anyway across the sand toward the barn's dark outline. The world narrowed to breath, heat, and the pounding of his boots. A bullet grazed his hat, another ripped through his sleeve. He didn't stop. When he reached the barn, he kicked the door open with his boot and ducked inside. The air smelled of hay, sweat, and old earth. He set her down gently in the corner. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. He followed the line of her shaking hand toward a pile of hay stacked against the wall. Silas shoved it aside, revealing a hatch half buried in dirt. "Good girl," he murmured. He pulled it open. The darkness below smelled of damp soil and hidden time. He helped her crawl in, her breath ragged, her skin burning hot with fever. She clutched his sleeve. "Don't stay," she whispered. "They'll kill you." He touched her face, rough fingers brushing away the sweat. "Let 'em try." Then he closed the hatch and turned toward the barn door. Just as it burst open, Callahan, the leader, tall, pale-eyed, smiling the kind of smile that promised nothing but cruelty, stepped inside with his shotgun raised. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "The war hero himself. Heard you were dead, Boone." "Not yet," Silas replied. Callahan's eyes flicked toward the blood trail on the floor. "She's here, ain't she?" "The big widow." Silas said nothing. Callahan grinned. "I'll tell you what. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." "You already took her husband," Silas said.
Ain't that enough?
Callahan shrugged. Debt's a funny thing. Some men pay in coin, some pay in blood. Silas moved first. The revolver barked once. Callahan staggered back, clutching his side, firing wild. The shot hit the lantern hanging overhead. Fire splashed across the straw, spreading fast. The barn came alive with orange fury. Horses screamed from their stalls. Smoke rolled thick and black. Silas ducked low, firing again. 2 more raiders fell. A third came through the smoke, swinging a rifle like a club. The butt connected with Silas's shoulder, knocking him down. He rolled, grabbed a pitchfork, and drove it up hard. The man fell, gurgling. The flames climbed higher, the heat unbearable. Outside, Callahan's remaining men shouted for him, their voices panicked. Silas dragged himself to his feet, half blind, coughing. He could feel the fire closing in. Somewhere below, he heard Martha pounding weakly on the cellar door, shouting his name through the smoke. He stumbled toward the hatch. His boots slipped on blood and ash. He knelt, coughing, fingers scrabbling at the handle. "Martha!" he shouted. "Stay down there! Don't open it till morning." "Silas, please!" she cried. He looked around, the walls collapsing, flames devouring the rafters, and knew he'd never make it out alive if he stayed another minute. But if he ran, the fire would spread to the cellar. She'd burn too. He found an old water trough and kicked it over the hatch, sealing it beneath the wet wood. He could hear her pounding, screaming for him, but the fire drowned her voice. He pressed his hand against the wood. "I promised him I'd never let you fall," he whispered. "And I won't." He turned toward the door, the revolver still warm in his grip. Callahan stumbled back inside, coughing, bleeding, laughing through the smoke. "You think you can save her?" Callahan choked out. "She'll die like the rest." Silas raised his gun. "Not tonight!" The last shot cracked like thunder. When the fire took the barn, the night burned bright enough to light half the desert. The riders fled into the dark, their leader silent forever. And beneath the ash and ruin, behind that soaked trough, Martha Calder breathed on, alive, waiting for the dawn that would tell her what the fire had taken and what it had saved. The morning came slow and quiet, the kind of silence that feels borrowed, like the world hadn't decided yet whether it should keep turning. Smoke hung low over the valley. The barn was nothing but a black skeleton, creaking in the wind. Ash floated through the air, soft as snow, settling on the ground that still smelled of fire and sorrow. Beneath that scorched earth, Martha Calder woke to the sound of her own heartbeat. Every breath hurt, every movement burned, but she was alive. Her body ached like it had been forged in the fire itself. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the charred wood above her, the faint sunlight seeping through cracks, and it all came flooding back. Silas. The fire. The gunshots. She pushed against the cellar door, but it didn't budge. It was heavy, waterlogged from the trough he'd dragged over it. She called his name, once, twice, no answer. The third time her voice broke. When she finally forced the hatch open, it was daylight. The smoke burned her eyes as she climbed through, hands shaking, body trembling. Her bare feet sank into wet ash. Everything she and Henry had built, the barn, the tools, the horses, all gone. She turned in a slow circle, coughing, looking for one thing that still mattered. Silas? Nothing. Only wind, whispering through what used to be her home. She limped across the yard, her body wrapped in a blood-stained sheet, her eyes scanning the horizon. Then she saw him, at first just a dark shape lying near the fence. She stumbled toward him, her legs buckling twice before she reached his side. He was lying face down, one hand clutching the revolver, the other still pressed against the earth like he was holding it together. The side of his face was streaked with soot and blood. The fire had licked close but hadn't taken him. "Silas," she whispered, falling to her knees beside him. Her fingers found his wrist, cold. "Too cold, no," she said softly. "Not you? Not after everything." She pressed her forehead to his back, the ash clinging to her hair, the smell of smoke and iron thick around her. She stayed that way for a long time, until the wind shifted and the sound of hooves approached from the distance. Her heart jumped. But these weren't raiders. The silhouettes were different. Men from town, neighbors, ranch hands who'd seen the fire and ridden out at dawn. "Martha," one called. "Lord Almighty." "Are you hurt?" She looked up, eyes rimmed red but fierce. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. But he's not. They carried Silas's body to what was left of the shade, beneath the one tree that hadn't burned. Martha knelt beside him as they covered him with a coat. One of the men, a younger ranch hand, asked softly, "Who was he?" She smiled faintly through her tears. A promise kept. The men lowered their heads. No one spoke after that. As the day warmed, Martha began to dig. The others offered to help, but she refused. She wanted to feel every inch of the earth, every handful of dirt. The ground was hard, but she was harder. When the grave was deep enough, she laid his revolver across his chest and whispered, "You kept your word, Silas Boone. I'll keep mine." That night, when the stars came out over the blackened ranch, Martha went to the ruins of the barn. The air was cool again. She found the cellar door still half open, the earth around it damp. Inside, untouched by flame, was the chest Henry had built, the one she'd told Silas about. She pulled it open. The gold was still there, shining dull and heavy in the lantern light. Coins, nuggets, a few silver bars. Enough to rebuild, to run again, maybe even to leave. She stared at it for a long moment before closing the lid. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Not like this." She took only one coin, one small round piece of her husband's dream, and carried it out to Silas's grave. She pressed it into the soil above his heart. "For the promise you paid in blood," she said. Then she sat beside the grave until dawn, wrapped in silence and smoke, watching the sky shift from black to gold. Days passed. The town helped her rebuild. The barn rose again, piece by piece. The pain dulled, but it never left. And every morning before sunrise, she'd walk out to the hill where the wind blew soft and the grass grew wild, and she'd talk to him. About the cattle, about the weather, about how the nights felt colder without his voice. Months later, a traveling preacher stopped by the ranch. He'd heard the story about the widow who survived the fire, the stranger who saved her, the bandits who never came back. He asked if she wanted a marker for the grave. She thought for a long moment, then nodded. The preacher carved the words himself. Simple and plain. Silas Boone. He pulled the arrow. He kept the promise. When the preacher left, Martha sat by the grave again. The sun was low, the same amber light that had filled the sky the day they met. She touched the stone and smiled through her tears. "You said you didn't believe in God," she whispered. "But maybe God still believed in you." The wind moved through the grass, gentle, almost like an answer. And from that day on, every rider who passed through those hills knew the story of the giant widow and the rancher who saved her. Not because of the gold buried beneath the barn, but because, in a world that had forgotten mercy, one man still had the courage to bleed for it. The land healed. The grass grew green again. And when folks asked her how she kept going, she'd smile and say, "Sometimes the thing that was meant to kill you becomes the thing that saves you." The camera would fade slowly on her standing there, tall, strong, with the sunrise behind her, the scar still faint on her shoulder, the grave beside her, and her voice echoing through the quiet dawn. "He didn't pull it to kill me. He pulled it to free me." The first spring after the fire came late, like a tired traveler who wasn't sure they were welcome. Snow held on in the gullies, while the cottonwoods tried on their pale greens. Martha rose before the sun as always, wrapped her shawl, and walked. The fence line with a mug of coffee that steamed in the cold. Frost broke under her boots with a sound like thin glass. Far off, a hawk called once and was gone. Work filled the days. New boards, new nails, new calves wobbling to their feet. The ranch had a different sound now, fewer voices, more wind, but it was alive. Some nights the silence tried to swallow her. On those nights she lit the little lantern Silas had left hanging on a nail by the door. It was bent, blackened by smoke, ugly as sin, but it held a stubborn flame. She would sit with it and talk to him the way lonely people talk to stars. One evening, while sorting old tack in the rebuilt barn, she found his saddle blanket rolled tight around a small tin box. It was stuck with ash and stiff from water. She pried it open with a knife. Inside lay a war medal dulled by smoke, a lock of blonde hair tied with blue thread, and a letter folded to the size of a prayer. The paper shook in her hands, but her voice was steady. "Boone, if this finds you, it means I didn't have the words while I still had time. You saved me once in a river of bullets. I never paid you proper. If anything ever happens to me, don't let Martha sell this land. She's taller than the wind and twice as stubborn. Stand with her. If you can't stand, crawl. If you can't crawl, die trying." H. Calder. She read it twice, then pressed the letter to her mouth, breathing the smoke of two men who'd believed in the same stubborn thing. She slipped the medal and the letter back into the tin and carried it to Silas's grave. The grass was just coming in, soft and brave. She set the tin down and said, "You did it, both of you. I'll do the rest." Years turned like slow pages. Travelers stopped for water and left with stories. Children arrived before she had time to wish for them. 2 orphan brothers from a flood to the east, all ribs and eyes and bad manners. They came to steal eggs and left with chores. The older, Caleb, stared at her like she was going to vanish if he blinked. The younger, Eli, talked enough for 3. The first night in the bunkhouse, Eli whispered across the straw, "Do you think the giant lady eats boys?" Caleb whispered back, "Only if they forget to close the chicken gate." Martha smiled to herself in the dark and pretended she hadn't heard. She taught them the shape of the land, where the creek bites after rain, where the ground lies hollow, where the wind sounds like someone you once loved calling your name. She showed them how to hold a frightened calf until it trusted the beat of your heart. She taught them to say grace even when they didn't know who they were talking to, because gratitude wasn't for God only. It was for the living who stayed. On the anniversary of the fire, she saddled 2 horses and led the boys to the hill with the lone tree. The sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. The marker caught the light. Silas Boone. He pulled the arrow. He kept the promise. She told them the story the way her heart remembered it, not the way gossip had polished it. She told it plain, without extra shine. The boys listened like the ground might change under them if they missed a breath. When she reached the part where the barn fell and the fire roared and the last shot was fired, Eli covered his ears. Caleb didn't move, only wet his lips and stared at the name on the stone. "Why'd he pull it if she told him not to?" Eli asked at last. "Because sometimes the fastest pain is the only bridge to the morning," Martha said. "And sometimes a promise is heavier than fear." Caleb crouched and put his hand on the dirt the way Silas had. He didn't say anything, but when he stood, he was different in the shoulders, the way boys get when a story chooses them. On the ride back, he asked to carry the lantern that had outlived the fire. She let him. The years did what years do. They sanded the sharp edges, left the true lines. The boys grew into men with hands that could both mend fences and play soft on a fiddle when the night asked for it. Caleb walked with Silas's quiet. Eli laughed with the kind of joy that makes dogs flop on their backs just to be near it. A woman from town, with a braid down to her waist, married Caleb under the cottonwoods. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the wind shifted, and Martha thought for a second she heard a dry chuckle out by the fence line, like a man who finally got his favorite part of the story. One winter, when the snow sat knee-high and mean, a stranger came riding out of the white like a bad idea. He was wrapped in a fur coat and carried a pistol with 3 notches. He asked for water with a smile that meant trouble. Martha gave it. You don't teach boys courage and then hide when your own is called for. She saw the brand on his horse and knew him for what he was, a remnant of the crew that used to run with Callahan back when cruelty had a payroll. "You the widow?" he asked, drinking with his eyes on the boys. "Still am," she said. "Heard tell you got gold buried out here. People bury all kinds of things," she said, steady. "Some of them walk back out with good manners." He laughed and put his cup down. "I figure I'll take a look around." "Figure you won't," Caleb said, stepping between the man and the door. The gun rose like a snake's head. The yard went quiet. Then from the porch, Eli lifted the old blackened lantern and lit it. The flame made a small, brave circle in the frost. He held it with two hands the way a child holds a truth, "Sir," he said, voice clear. "We don't draw first on this ranch, but we don't fall either." The stranger stared at the flame, at the boys, at the woman who didn't blink. Some silences are short. This one had miles in it. He lowered the gun, swung onto his horse and rode away without looking back. The sound of hooves faded into clean snow. That night, Martha stood by the grave, her breath a white ribbon in the dark. "Still watching?" she asked the stone. The wind moved through the cottonwoods in that old way that never says yes, but never says no. Spring after spring, the ranch stitched itself stronger. The creek ran clear again where the fire had turned it black. Wildflowers insisted on joy at the fence posts. Children learned the map of the sky by the names of the cows they helped at calving. Every year on the fire night, lanterns were set out along the path from the barn to the tree, and the youngest hand would tell the story in his own words. Sometimes the telling was clumsy. That was all right. Courage doesn't care about good grammar. When Martha's hair turned full silver, a peddler with a box of city wonders arrived. He carried a machine that made pictures from light. The children pressed in, wide-eyed. Martha said yes. She dressed in her work clothes, the ones that fit her like purpose, and stood by the creek where Henry had once carved their names on a rock. Caleb's wife smoothed the front of Martha's dress with a palm that trembled. "You sure you want the scar showing?" she asked. Martha touched the faint line along her shoulder, the place where fire and steel had argued and mercy won. "That's the part I want the world to see," she said. They took the picture. In it, she stands tall as the tree, eyes bright, one hand on the blackened lantern, the creek making its quiet silver sentence behind her. If you look close, you can see the grave just out of focus on the hill, like a man who has stepped back to let others stand in the light. When the peddler left, the house felt large and full. Martha sat by the door with a cup of coffee that steamed in the evening chill. The boys, men now, played cards by the stove. A baby slept in a cradle made from old barnwood. The dog dreamed with its paws twitching. All the living sounds found their places and made a single music. She spoke into that music the way she always had when a day closed right. "Silas Boone," she said softly, "you didn't pull it to kill me. You pulled it to free me. And because you did, look what kept growing." Outside, the wind breathed across the field and through the cottonwoods, carrying the smell of new grass and old smoke, the two scents braided forever. If this story found a home in you, if it made your hands feel warmer around a cup, if it made you remember a promise you meant to keep, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. There are more trails to ride, more nights to light with one small, stubborn flame. This is WestTale Story. See you next time.